Let's say you're creating a world and game mechanics where the most important thing is the bond the players share between them and their Pokémon. How hard could that be? In the episode Redesigning the Battles, I went through a list of design criteria and proposed a new system. However, there was one element to the criteria I didn't have room to talk about. A kind of hidden, secret, extra element to design that Pokémon is aiming for. To have the players feel a bond with their Pokémon. Now, I'm not talking about game mechanics here like friendship points or happiness levels. I'm talking about the real-world player genuinely caring about the pixels on the screen. Saying it like that sounds bizarre and cold, but in truth, those feelings are visceral and important. From a game development point of view, it is that bond that brings the players back to keep playing. From a social, humanitarian point of view, playing the game becomes a constant practice of compassion, or at least, in theory it is. To the developers in Game Freak, this bond is one of the most important aspects they are aiming to achieve in the Pokémon games. And why wouldn't it be? Making a connection with another creature is a very powerful emotion. You feel it with your pets or when a wild animal trusts you enough to feed it. There are interviews with the creators about how important it is to them that this element exists in these games. There is something really fun and kind of wonderful about experiencing that connection. So, one of the reasons I did an exercise of removing stats from Pokémon was to try to account for this secret criteria. A benefit of removing stats from them is that because players aren't trying to optimize the fun out of the game by grinding, the Pokémon they go on a journey with will naturally help foster that bond. There isn't that nagging feeling in the back of their head saying, yeah, but my buddy could have been more powerful if I caught a different one. I wanted to remove the temptation to disassociate your Pokémon into what is statistically perfect or not worth your time. Again, yes, not everyone does this, but removing temptations as much as possible is, I believe, a positive step. So what even is bonding? To spare us from falling down the psychological rabbit hole of articles and studies on the matter, I have taken the liberty of digging through this concept and will simply show you my findings and the conclusions I've come to. Between people, it's a mutual mental and emotional attachment to each other, typically through shared experiences and interests. Looking beyond the surface level, we find elements like empathy and compassion playing an important role. That's all cool and good, but how does this help us as game designers? Well, this is where it gets interesting. I've done a bunch of research on different mediums, from how story writers evoke a relationship between the protagonist and the reader, to watching videos on team building exercises, and I've come up with 8 basic categories for how to create a bond. Keep in mind that while going through this list, I'm focusing on the perspective of the witness or the observer from the outside developing empathy or compassion to another individual or fictional character. Since these are the vital ingredients for creating a bond, we need to know what sparks their creation. Also, I'm just talking about bonding itself first. We will come back to how this ties into video games and Pokémon afterwards. Number 1. Expressing affection. One aspect you might be expecting me to talk about is love or respect. True enough, if you have developed a positive bond towards a person, then either one or both of them are now present. For example, you might not love your coworkers, but when you bond with them, you certainly develop respect. If neither of these two aspects are present, then who is to say there is a bond at all? But love and respect might be more related to the results of a positive bond rather than the ingredients of it. However, what is very much an ingredient is the ability to express and listen to the expression of affection, or in other words, communication. If you are not familiar with the concept of the 5 love languages, then I highly recommend researching the topic. They are a very insightful mental model for how people communicate in relationships, and you might learn something about yourself. In short, these 5 love languages are words of affirmation, gift-giving, acts of service, physical touch, and quality time. So you can see how these love languages are very important to bonding. Assuming that consent is present, Expressing affection works to nurture the primal need to love and be loved. The only way to know that you are giving and receiving it properly is by communication. However, people tend to have different ways of communicating and accepting love or respect. So understanding how someone best hears or speaks a love language goes a long way to making sure that everyone's needs are met. If everyone is speaking well and being heard, then I can say with bold confidence that bonds are being formed indeed. Another element you might expect me to focus on is trust, because absolutely, broken trust is broken bonds. But just because you trust someone doesn't mean you have a connection to them. Like I said, I'm looking at the elements that promote bonds, not the ones that maintain them. Trust is important, but it's not what sparks the fire. And in some cases, it doesn't need to be present at all. Number 2. External threats. Experiencing danger in any form is a traumatizing event. Witnessing someone else go through that danger may provoke empathy. Equally traumatizing is the experience of suffering loss and going through grief. These are both elements that we have to process as a result of something typically out of our control. You can see this in a lot of stories where the audience gets to know what a character deeply cares about, and then they all feel the tension when those things get harmed. Another way to look at this category is how two soldiers sharing a trench in a war zone would develop a bond over their circumstances. When someone is reading a book about a character in that war zone, they too are in the trenches together. From a more subtle approach to this category, there is also watching someone experience an injustice and being treated unfairly. We all know how that feels, so it becomes a very quick way to relate to someone. Number 3. Internal struggles. Obviously, the flip side to facing threats from outside of ourselves are the threats from within. Witnessing a character fight their demons, debate their own morals, face their fears, successful or not, is appealing to the audience, because who doesn't relate to having a deep emotional struggle? Again, taking a more subtle approach, simply facing a dilemma, being forced to make an impossible decision, is an intense ordeal. Number 4. The projected virtues. Going to a more positive note are the qualities one can admire in others, and there are 3 parts to it. The first is discovering such traits within a person like courage, compassion, loyalty, generosity, etc. All desirable marks that make them much more attractive. Knowing you are investing your emotions in a good person makes that investment a safe one. You can't bond with what you don't trust, at least not easily. In story writing, this is often referred to as saving the cat, a trope used so often that there is even a book about it. In general, it is when the story takes a moment to show a positive trait in a protagonist so the audience grows attached to them, like helping an old lady cross the street. The second part is witnessing a display of great talent. People really enjoy watching those who are really good at something. It is incredibly satisfying to watch someone do something really well. When you think about it, this is probably the strongest element that creates celebrities. Talent draws the attention and admiration of the crowd. The third part to projected virtues is when a person or character displays something unique about themselves, something that grabs your attention. Perhaps they are beautiful, strong, quirky, or wild. Being the odd one out is really good, so long as you do it without being alienating. Number 5. Aspirations. Without a goal, there is no journey. Passion is an attractive trait, and although you will find people whose desires are different from yours, when they have an unstoppable drive to achieve it, you might catch yourself respecting them for it. The toned-down version of this is simply sharing a common interest. It's a lot of fun talking with people who feel the same way about a certain topic as you do. This is a very good way to make friends. It's the same driving force behind a group of fans rallying around their favorite sports ball team. Passion isn't just attractive, it's infectious. Of course, even without passion, a group of people all helping each other achieve a goal works really well to bond them when they are organized. Without being organized, people tend to clash, so this category can have the opposite effect of bonding if things go badly. Number 6. Responsibility and dependency. If you've ever been put in charge of looking after a younger sibling or had to take care of a pet, you learn very quickly that if something goes wrong, it is your fault. From then on, For most people, a new instinct has been ingrained and kicks in when supervision falls on your shoulders. A kind of responsibility of care becomes instilled in your mind. For a lot of people, that can turn into genuinely caring about those they look after. If you are in charge of a team of people at work, keeping them happy and organized could be very rewarding. From the other side of the fence, when you are dependent on someone or something for food or protection, provided they also show affection for you, you can also grow a fondness for what looks out for your well-being. This happens to children and pets from their end. Ideally, anyway, would be nice if my cat showed some gratitude once in a while. An interesting note, however, when looking into dependency, is how it can fail to cause a bond because the source of food, protection, etc. is inconsistent and unreliable. Again, you can't bond with what you can't trust, at least, not easily. Number 7. Memorable moments. This is all about the collection of impressions left on you by someone. It's not so much about the length of time spent with them as it is the quality and amount of memories. Every bond you make is a moment of time where you got to know someone better or shared an experience together. Provided those experiences aren't outweighed by negative memories, then they deepen the bond. You may be familiar with having a friend that you don't see often, but when you do, finding that nothing has diminished in the relationship. I believe it is this category responsible for this phenomenon. It doesn't matter how much time has passed when you share deep connections. I believe this is also responsible for our feelings of nostalgia. Connections to one's past rekindles bonds very quickly. Lastly, we have number 8, the mirrored self. This is the element that you can typically find in all other categories, the line that joins the dots. Without being able to relate to what you are connecting to, most other categories just don't work. This is empathy and understanding. This is the external made personal. There is definitely a large element of this in common interests. You are seeing yourself in them. When your affection is reciprocated, when you both carry a trauma or struggle, when you are responsible where once you were dependent, you share that bond. This element can also massively backfire. Seeing yourself in another person can be extremely confronting if what you see is less than desirable. And of course, these categories rarely work independently. They all have to work in combination. For example, gift-giving is also showing the desired virtue of generosity while potentially displaying a common interest, which contributes to the memorable moments over time. Once again, all of this is cool and good, but how does this translate to game mechanics? The answer to that is pretty well, actually. So let's run through the list again, and as a bonus, I'll mention what Pokemon does well in these categories as we go. For just a bit of housekeeping, before we rerun the categories, I need to define intrinsic and extrinsic motivation types for those that might not be familiar. There are already videos out there that do this very well, and you should watch them, but here's the quick explanation. Intrinsic motivation is wanting to do something for its own sake and not for any reward, like learning to draw because you enjoy it. Extrinsic motivation is wanting to do something specifically so you can get the reward, like working a job so you can get money. Games have these two types of motivations built into them all the time. Are you doing this quest because you are enjoying the story or mechanics involved, or are you doing it because you know it gives you a powerful sword at the end? So with that in mind, let's begin. Expressing affection. There are lots of ways to express yourself in games, and the 5 love languages each create room for mechanics. Words of affirmation, from the player's perspective, could be dialogue options, like telling a character how much you want to increase your relationship points with them. Sorry, that was a joke. In my opinion, a nicer dialogue system is one where you get to know the personality more for its own sake instead of pick this for romance options. Motivations, am I right? To receive words of affirmation from those characters, such as that from Pokemon, having them simply emote love hearts in your direction can be very charming. Gift-giving is pretty self-explanatory, just like dialogue options or emotes, but there are inventory items involved. Let's Go Eevee Pikachu did this by letting us feed them berries, and in return they might randomly find a nice trinket. Acts of service. This could be anything from a quest they give you to complete, or giving your virtual pet a bath. Physical touch, apart from the obvious ways this can be done inside a game, we can't actually physically touch these digital worlds. Yet. But we do have things like touchscreens, motion controls, and VR interactions. Otherwise, yes, there is living vicariously through your avatar holding hands. You could even argue that buying a plushie or the like is a way to engage in the franchise in a physical manner. Quality time comes from the concept of giving your partner your undivided attention. Games can naturally allow for this just through hours played, but giving the player options for how they want to spend that time is most important. Perhaps there are entire sets of optional dialogue to engage in, but allowing the player to perform acts from the other love languages at their own pace could be enough here. For expressing affection in Pokemon, they have had mixed success in this category, and I'll go into this later, but for now, I'll say that sometimes a small but rather effective way to feel a bond within a game is simply to put a pat the dog button in. External threats, battle mechanics, or anything that helps you avoid danger. The two sides of this coin are harm and loss. You fight to avoid harm and not lose the game, sure, but the most interesting examples are when you are fighting to avoid harm to other characters beyond a personal one you control. Fire Emblem games have permadeath mechanics where if a character dies on the field, they are no longer available for the rest of the game. In the case of the Banner Saga, those characters are dead for the rest of the sequels, and Guz Lord do you feel those losses. Until you reload. In most Pokemon games, you are not the one taking the hits, they are. You work to keep your team as conscious as possible against increasing threats, so Pokemon has a very strong element of bonding built into its core. Win or lose, you share every victory and especially every defeat with your team. This is helpful. Internal struggles. This is the intrinsic motivations the player develops over the course of the game. They want to get better, stronger, devise strategies, overcome challenges, and make progress. You get the idea. The games that do this best are the ones that, in order for the player to achieve what they want, they have to make sacrifices because there is no perfect solution. This doesn't just relate to puzzles or strategy games, this also relates to times where the player has to walk into what is clearly the next boss encounter. That anticipation, the internal struggle, however brief, to take a brave step forward can create a bonding moment with whoever tried to help you get out the other side alive. Again, Pokemon has this built into its core gameplay with the element type chart mechanic and having to face rivals and gym leaders. Every Pokemon has a weakness and none of them can perfectly match all opponents. Building a team that can handle most situations is going to take some internal debating and brave steps forward. The projected virtues. Are they cool, cute, do they have enough missiles? Or perhaps they simply have a personality and a story arc you can really get invested in. This all comes down to character designers or story writers. For Pokemon, their vast array of cool, cute, and quirky creatures really gives them an edge in this category. Beyond them, however, we typically have main characters like rivals or gym leaders grabbing our attention. Essentially, it is here that before a new generation comes out, a whole lot of players are praying that Game Freak has done a really good job. Aspirations. These are the intrinsic motivations on a grander scale. Do the players want to see the story to the end, beat the hardest boss, collect all the things? It would be difficult not to feel an attachment to whatever helped you achieve those goals. Obviously, the story of Pokemon revolves around either filling out the Pokédex or becoming the best like no one ever was. But let's look at this from another point of view. The Pokemon themselves can fulfill an aspiration in the player in a few different ways as well. You can aspire to have a certain Pokemon on your team because you like how it looks or what offensive traits it can offer your strategy. Perhaps you found a Pokemon you have never seen before and aspire to discover its full potential. For Pokemon games specifically, this aspect seems to complement the previous three categories very nicely. Responsibility and dependency. Virtual pets like the old Tamagotchi springs to mind here, or horse care games like Red Dead Redemption 2. It's up to you to feed and play with them, but another strong example of this in games is the one I brought up before with Fire Emblem and the Banner Saga. You are responsible for keeping these characters alive. When looking at dependency, any system that grants cool abilities to help progress is especially nice when those boons come from a character. Just look at the game Hades. In order to advance, you have to rely on the powers granted to you by your Olympian relatives, and I, for one, found them all quite charming to boot. You are responsible for the well-being and sometimes happiness of your Pokemon, and you depend on them to get you through the game. Although this won't guarantee you feel a bond, it lays a solid foundation for it. Memorable moments. I will stress this point again. Hours played is not the goal here. A game with a very short playtime can have a much grander impact on you than even the longest playtime of other games. My instinct is to say that narrative and character moments have the greatest chance of making an impact. But then I remember all the times in games where I made it through a really tough fight by the skin of my teeth and feeling that same boost. I think it's important to note that, from the player's perspective, just because something isn't written in a script doesn't mean it wasn't part of the game's story. Again, I believe Pokemon has had mixed success here. The most impactful moments I've heard often from other players are the ones they created for themselves playing through the game. Very few standout story beats have happened through the series, and let's face it, Pokemon games are not known for delivering award-winning narratives. However, to their credit, the combination of the battle system, type chart, and gym challenges all work together to create the space for personally driven narrative to occur. The mirrored self. In books and games, the audience puts themselves in the shoes of the main character. It's a natural human instinct. When you are driving a car and need to turn left, you don't think, I will turn the wheel and make the car move left. You think, I will go left, and then you just do it. Even in games where you are in control of many characters or a whole army, people put themselves in the shoes of the commander or a godly position. Therefore, we don't have to worry about this too much mechanically. But what we do have to be wary of in game development is establishing player autonomy over certain mechanics, only to later take away that control. I'm sure we can all think of a moment where we wanted to make a decision or take an action, only for the game to not allow it because of story reasons. Although Pokemon does fine in this category, you are the trainer exploring this world, there is something to be said about mechanics to be wary of, mechanics that can undermine all the ones that are working towards bonding. So far, I've mentioned a lot of things Pokemon is doing right, but that doesn't mean they can't do things that will undermine all the good work and prevent the bonds from being formed. Now let's look at some of the mechanics that can break bonds or otherwise work against the philosophy of bonding itself. I'll spare you the grief of sorting them into the categories I mentioned before, if only because each mechanic will likely be detrimental to more than one category at a time. Just like the last time, I'll go through the things that Pokemon has done, and the bonus this round is I'll attempt a solution to these problematic mechanics. Comparative value. I'll get this one out of the way because I've already spent an entire episode addressing it. Any mechanic that can be used to disassociate those you wish to care about into raw numbers and efficiencies is going to do that almost to the exclusion of all else. Too many people are tempted to discard creatures or characters in a game that is less powerful or not as rare than the ones they might actually have a better time with. In Genshin Impact, people are encouraged to simply play whatever characters they like or have fun with, but the sudden difficulty curve coupled with the leveling requirements for characters and equipment quickly has people searching online for best strategies. Once you progress far enough into the game, the ability to construct any team you want on a whim that could survive the fights becomes a very costly and time-consuming investment. Pokemon is susceptible to this. My suggestion is to remove the stats. Game difficulty. In order for a game to have a hope of people playing it, it needs to be engaging in some aspect. Giving a challenge to be mastered is one such aspect. So remembering that shared struggles forge bonds and that challenge can make for fun gameplay, giving the players a difficulty setting could really go a long way. I think a lot of people have already expressed that they would enjoy a difficulty setting in Pokemon, so now you can count myself among them. Unfortunately, Pokemon did a lot of things in Sword and Shield that took the challenge out of the gameplay. The non-optional shared experience system makes all the Pokemon on your team level up, whether or not they even saw the battlefield. The reason, it seems, Game Freak did this stems from a belief they hold that children have a short attention span and need progress to happen quickly. I'm not kidding, here's the quote. And I don't think I need to tell you how much I disagree with that. On the note of the shared experience system, by having it be non-optional, this also harms that quality time aspect of bonding because they don't need you to give them any attention in order to level up. Investing your personal efforts towards having them win battles is no small act. This also means that having items that increase the power and levels of Pokemon automatically greatly cheats you out of that quality time aspect as well. The only upshot is that those items are somewhat like an act of gift giving. Regardless of whether experience share is on or off, if the difficulty curve doesn't match the player's power growth, then nobody is using all 6 of the Pokemon they bring along with them either way. In Sword and Shield, Game Freak never made a trainer be much of a threat against the player by being overly leveled at any point, which was an interesting choice considering you could definitely find monstrously high-leveled Pokemon in the wild area, which was awesome. Ultimately, people like it when they have a story to tell about that time they beat the boss with only 1 health point left. I don't believe game developers should be afraid of their players losing a few rounds. A game without challenges to master is one that has struggles and player motivations dulled if you haven't replaced them appropriately. From the other side of this coin, bonding can be harmed by the game being too difficult as well. Pokemon on a team might get left behind when they can't battle as effectively as the new ones that come in. Butterfree is likely to be left behind because it can't keep up with the game's challenges without extra effort from the player. Shallow exploration. Since it is important to create memorable moments not just in battles but in the journey traveled as well, there are a few ways to do this. I mentioned before that there can be emotional story moments with characters and narrative, but we can also achieve this visually through the game's environments. I've already covered this idea to some extent in the ecosystems episode. I think a reboot is a perfect time to redesign how the environments work in Pokemon. If the animals you can find are weird and wonderful, then the plants they have a relationship with too should be equally weird and wonderful. Who knows how many secrets could be hidden around the next corner? Again, looking at Sword and Shield, outside of the wild areas, whenever there was a branching path to explore, it was almost always immediately presented with a dead end. Inside of the wild areas, players were expecting to be able to find more hidden secrets, puzzles, and special spots for rare Pokemon. Instead, it seems those opportunities were a rare occasion. Take the ruined watchtower, for example. Yes, there are ghost-type Pokemon surrounding it. But no, there is nothing much to actually do with the tower. No dungeon to explore or puzzles to solve. It's just a unique eye-catcher. It's as if its only purpose was to justify the existence of ghost-type Pokemon spawning on the map. Anyway, by not creating environments that fill us with awe, have secrets to find, or hidden challenges, players are robbed of potential memories, aspirations, struggles, and appealing virtues associated with all of that. Shallow interactions. Let's get into that mixed success I mentioned much earlier. Don't get me wrong here, I don't think the interaction mechanics introduced in the recent generations are bad. I actually believe that these mechanics are big steps in the right direction for Pokemon. I just think there has been a little misstep with them. But before I get into that, I want to give praise where praise is definitely due. In X and Y, the AMI feature allowed players to feed, pat, and play minigames with their Pokemon. This was really cool. It's pretty much all the types of expressing affection rolled into one place with a little responsibility thrown in. My only critique on the programming side is that all the same Pokemon shared their liked and disliked areas for being petted. All Oddish desired getting their leaves brushed, but disliked you touching their feet. It would have been nice for just a little variety to give the sense of unique personalities, but really, I don't hold this against Game Freak at all. They had hundreds of Pokemon to program this all for. It was an amazing job, and the benefit was that a lot of people felt closer to their Pokemon than ever before. For Sun and Moon, the refresh feature was just the AMI without the minigames. This was fine, the minigames were not necessary, but their absence meant that you couldn't play with them anymore. Then, going into Sword and Shield, they had introduced the camping feature, a pretty decent new way to play with your Pokemon. But where did the AMI feature go? Now was the time to take that mechanic to new heights, not leave it behind. However, that issue aside, yes, that was not the misstep I was speaking of. All 3 features suffer from one flaw. they all reward the player with buffs to the Pokemon you gave attention to. Now, before you roast me in the comments, hear me out. Remember, I'm not saying that these buffs are doing the game's harm, just that they interfere with bonding with Pokemon more than they encourage it, and here is the reason why. The over-justification effect. Lots of studies show that the most effective motivation is the intrinsic type. The over-justification effect is, simply put, turning intrinsic motivation into extrinsic. There is a very good video on this by Game Maker's Toolkit titled The Psychological Trick That Can Make Rewards Backfire. You should absolutely watch it, but for now, I'll just quote the relevant part here. There is a huge body of evidence that says when extrinsic motivation is attached to a task that we already find intrinsically motivating, we suddenly become way less interested in the task. And other studies show rewards can also make people less creative, worse at problem solving, more prone to cheating, and may lose motivation entirely once the rewards stop, even though previously they were happy to do it for its own sake. End quote. Because Pokemon would receive a bonus to critical hit rates, dodging, or even tough it out on the odd occasion and survive a lethal blow with 1 health point, the reason to give your Pokemon affection becomes an extrinsic reward the moment the players discover this mechanic. So to be very clear, surviving a deadly blow because it didn't want to make you sad is a very good bonding moment. But once the player connects the mechanical reason why that happened to the gameplay, it loses that effect and may actually do the opposite now. To give you an example of showing affection backfiring, in the Dragon Age series, gift giving was something really good to start with. You wanted to do it because you wanted to do something nice for the people on your team. The relationship points you gain are great, but you get them from doing lots of things like making choices they agree with whilst in their company, or going through their dialogue options. However, something changes. Giving the right gift unlocked new quests. Now that simple gesture has turned from a bonding experience to a currency for content. They become an extrinsic motivation within the player because the only way to get those extra quests was dependent on giving the right gift. They may not have always been intuitive either. It was more likely people would just look up online what the right answer was. Additionally, dialogue options and narrative moments that went badly could be made up for quickly and easily with the right gift, so even consequences became negligible. The most important thing when having interaction mechanics is for the players to want to do it purely for its own sake. Even Pokemon Yellow did it very well. All you could do was turn around and talk to your Pikachu and get a picture on the screen of how it was feeling. I remember when I played through it, whenever I did anything, I would check to see how Pikachu felt about it. This simple concept left that interaction up to your imagination. Over the course of your journey together, Pikachu responded with more love for you, and love is its own reward. Pikachu didn't perform any better or worse in combat from doing this, it just loved you. Lastly on my list of anti-bonding ingredients, ludonarrative dissonance. The overly fancy way of saying the game's narrative and the game's mechanics are telling two different stories. For example, a game might tell you that the world will end in 2 days unless you do the thing, but then the player can go off and do side quests for 100 hours. Or a character could have a traumatic event with needing to kill, and then the player turns them into a murder machine. To talk about this for Pokemon, I think it is best to say it all in this video's summary. So, the TLDW of this episode, and the observation I can make once you add everything up I just put forward, is that there is a larger, deeper, darker issue at hand when it comes to the idea of bonding with Pokemon. The game mechanics are both working towards and against that ideal. The premise of these games is that you are stealing creatures from the environment and putting them into battles, all for your own goal of attaining the glorious position of champion. Or perhaps people are just collecting them for study, not even interacting with them as they get sent off to the PC storage boxes permanently. The Pokemon mechanics of fighting each other, gaining experience, and becoming stronger is, at its core, a violent mechanic. It comes from games like Final Fantasy or Dungeons & Dragons, where the only way to progress is to engage in violence because the only way to gain experience and levels is to beat up monsters. You track the stats of how you get stronger, and in Pokemon these days, you have many, many methods to specifically control their growth. Not a lot of room for compassion when you're turning them into efficient weapons of mass destruction through dispassionate number balancing. On this note, I recommend a video from Extra Credits titled Mechanics Shaping Story. You will see where it had a strong influence on my script for this little bit. Throughout video game history, so many games defaulted to using violence as a way to progress that when a little game called Undertale came along to challenge that idea, it became wildly successful. So what can we do here? Should we design a completely different game mechanic? The reason I decided to only tweak how battles work instead of completely change them in the previous episode was because it is those mechanics that people are most familiar with and engage in. This is probably where the most amount of fun is found, and as I said before, going through struggles with your team is an important aspect to bonding with them. So indeed, the mechanics are not completely against bonding. But it doesn't help. So in response to this dilemma, Game Freak has gone to great lengths to sell the idea that Pokemon actually enjoy doing this. Because, getting hit with a fire blast, I'm sure, is just so much fun. Well, if we were to try to solve this, what are our options? We could abandon battling and come up with an entirely new mechanic that focuses and encourages bonding with Pokemon. But that is a giant gamble. There is no guarantee that people would enjoy it. We could take leveling up away from battling exclusively, introduce other ways of getting it, and for battling to not always be rewarded as mentioned in the Extra Credits video. Eddie Webb took this approach with his tabletop RPG, Pugmire. This could be really interesting. However, how many new mechanics would we have to introduce to ensure that people have options? This is a lot easier to do in a tabletop setting because you can nebulously decide when it is appropriate to level up with your fellow players. This is a video game, so there needs to be more solid rules. Battling, however, is an interesting part of the world building. Is there anything wrong with actually having these creatures really just love battling all the time? In nature, that typically results in one animal eating another, but for Pokemon, they might enjoy battling each other as a way to toughen up and prepare themselves for such fights for survival. Thanks to human interference, the death part happens a lot less, and we can show this aspect in the games too. Remember, the games can target adults more now. So the problem is, if Pokemon wasn't a battle strategy game with a dark side we don't speak of, then what would it be? The options are endless here. There are countless ways to employ mechanics that may or may not enhance the light and colourful world building Pokemon is going for. Countless ways to encourage that special bond. But short of building and testing them all, how would we know which is best for Pokemon? And let me tell you this now, if I ever think up a way to have an action-packed monster collection game that keeps it light and colourful and maintains that special recipe for loving the creatures you tame, I'll make that game. But in the meantime, maybe Pokemon games could embrace that darker side. Just because a world contains things like death and violence doesn't mean there isn't room for compassion and joy. There is a great opportunity for creating tension in a story just by opening that door and taking a few brave steps forward. Thanks for watching. If you got this far into the video, I really appreciate it. I put a lot of research into this one, so go ahead and press the like button and hitting the bell icon. You could even make a bond with my Wooloo by clicking the subscribe button. She loves subscribers. Otherwise, continue to be wonderful to each other, and I'll see you next time.